was still the first day of the week, that evening while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities. Jesus came and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the disciples saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you don't forgive them, they aren't forgiven." Thomas, the one called Didymus, one of the 12, wasn't with the disciples when Jesus came. The other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he replied, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger in the wounds left by the nails, and put my hand into his side, I won't believe." After 8 days, his disciples were again in a house, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus entered and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into my side. No more disbelief. Believe." Thomas responded to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." Jesus replied, "Do you believe because you see me? Happy are those who don't see and yet believe." Then Jesus did many other miraculous signs in his disciples' presence, signs that aren't recorded in the scroll. But these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing you will have life in his name. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Will you pray with me? God of love and God of grace, this is your time, and we are your people. Open our hearts, our minds, and our lives to your presence, that we would hear your word and respond with all that we are. Amen. Well, today, as we said, is the continuation of Easter. We call it the second Sunday in the Easter celebration and these great 50 days. And we really continued the conversation we began last week with the unbelievability of the resurrection story. As we talk about, is it fake news or is it good news? This idea to us that it is for sure unbelievable. And for us, it can be unbelievable as it was for those who experienced this firsthand. Unbelievable in the worst ways, that there's truly nothing to support this news. We need evidence, we need facts, we need the scientific reasoning behind it all, or there's another side of the story that says it is unbelievable in the best way. That it is unbelievable in a way that you have to experience what we've seen, but it may be more complex or more mysterious than what I could point out with some kind of logical explanation or equation or way of looking at the world. And so we walk in the footsteps of Thomas today, who gets a very bad rap. I am a big fan of Thomas and the way that he is honest, at least, with his doubts and his struggles about what's going on. It's not like he does anything different than anyone else in the story. Mary shows up, the tomb's empty. She says, "Where have they taken my Lord?" And it takes her confusing Jesus as the gardener for her to then see, oh wait, something else is going on here. Last week we talked about how Peter and the beloved disciple, who we believe is probably the author of the Gospel of John, how they run into the tomb. They see and maybe believe, don't understand. They're not exactly going out proclaiming this great news that he has risen to the world yet. And it isn't until he shows up and breathes into the room of peace in the Spirit that they are like, you have got to see this. They're like, Mary was right. I don't know why we didn't listen to Mary in the first place, our first preacher in the gospel, but she was right. And of course, Thomas was not there. We don't know. He maybe had to go to the grocery store. He had some errands to run. We don't really know what was going on with Thomas, but he wasn't there. And he does the same thing that everyone else does. He maybe doubles down a little bit. Show me the marks in his hands. I mean, this is pretty graphic, y'all. You're going to tell me this guy came back from this terrible ending? It was awful. He's like, this is unreasonable for you to tell me this, and in fact, I think you're manipulating my emotions. I read that into what Thomas might be saying. This is not cool. Is Ashton Kutcher around? Am I about to get punked? What is going on here? I need to see the wounds and see the hands if you're going to tell me this is actually happening, because there is no evidence to suggest that this is real. It's unbelievable. Until it's not. And Jesus shows up again. I wonder where we are in the story. I wonder where we are with any of these experiences with doubt and struggle. I personally go back and forth with this text because I think there's this invitation, like, leave your doubts behind and embrace faith. And seeing isn't believing, believing is seeing, to quote that great text, The Santa Claus with Tim Allen from the early 90s. It is a thing I struggle with, though, because that sounds like a really nice idea, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest in the world that there's a lot of pain that just a nice, happy thought is not going to overcome. That there's a lot of grief and a lot of heartbreak that just a nice, positive thought is not going to overcome. I wonder about those people who heard this story for the first time, because as best we know, Thomas and those other followers of Christ were some of the last ones to have that kind of personal encounter of getting to see the nails in the hands and the wounds in the side. There was a whole generation of people who heard this gospel nearly a century after Jesus lived, who never got the chance that Thomas got, who had to wonder if their faith was worth anything because their faith was really risking their lives in their world, who had to wonder if their faith was worth anything because their faith was driving them apart from their families, who felt a lot of real grief and heartache and physical pain. And I would imagine some doubt of, is it worth it? And I wonder if they're kind of working their doubt and struggle out through the gospel with Jesus. Will you show up for us like you showed up for Thomas? Will you be alive for us the way you were alive for that generation before us? And I feel that same kind of anguish now, a couple of millennia later, where maybe we have our own wounds and pains and weight of life to bear, and we wonder, will I experience that kind of hope tangibly, believably, undeniably like those who before me have seen and experienced? I don't know. I don't believe that this is a story about doubt as weakness for faith. That, oh, you got to leave your doubt behind if you want to have faith. As we'll see, as the Gospel of John gets to its end, the disciples still struggle with this. They decide to go fishing afterward, and Jesus shows up on the beach to talk to them and saying, what are you doing, guys? We just talked. We met in the room. We had this whole thing. Go and do the work. There is a mixed bag of what it means to believe and see in the midst of doubt and struggle. I think a lot of times there's this idea, and we receive it all the time, that doubt is the enemy of faith, and I just absolutely don't believe that at all. If anything, I think certainty can give us more problem with faith, because the world does not always give us answers, and we hope that faith is going to give us the solution. That faith is going to provide that mystery equation that if we plug in all the right parts, all of the answers will be there, and yet so often we are let down. We're either let down because God hasn't shown up, or we're let down because the people who claim the faith don't show up, or we are let down because we can't feel it within ourselves, whatever it is. Certainty, I think, so often can undermine our hopes and our expectations of what faith might look like and be like and where God might be present. I think doubt keeps us journeying. I think doubt keeps us curious. I think doubt keeps us growing. At least it does for me. At least it does for me. I just like the humanity in the story a lot, to be completely honest. I think there's a lot of real emotion as these friends are grieving the loss of their friend, their teacher, their guide, their leader. And they have no idea what life looks like after this. They had made maybe a nice 10-year plan, 5-year plan with Jesus. Oh yeah, we're going to teach for a little bit. We're going to go from town to town. Maybe we're going to get some power and some influence and make something of ourselves with this guy. And then all of a sudden, their story has the plug pulled on it. And they're left with nothing. They don't know if they can even return home because of the life they've chosen with Christ. They don't know if they have any kind of hope for a future because, as it says, they were hiding out afraid because their leader, their guide, their teacher was just arrested and executed. If they show their head around too much, are they next? There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of hopelessness. I think there is a lot of wonder about where in the world do we go from here? Is there any hope or good news? And into that, they find that the story is somehow different than they had imagined in so many ways. As I said last week on Easter, I'm not the kind of preacher or the kind of Christian to even try to get into the actual details of how a tomb gets empty, how a man is dead and then is not dead. It is a mystery to me. It is absolutely a mystery to me to how they sit in a locked room, hiding out, just trying to comfort one another, and their friend shows up in their midst, unnoticed, bringing peace. That is a mystery. And it's a mystery to me how Thomas has any other experience than saying, "Show me the proof." For me, with my doubts and my own experience of faith, it is probably less about trying to solve the mystery and, oh my goodness, do we love to solve the mysteries, and learning to sit with the mystery. Anyone here fans of like crime shows, CSI, any of that kind of stuff? For some people, it's appointment viewing. This is not a genre of television that I'm into. Some beloved in-laws and other blood relatives of mine are super into these shows, and I find myself checking my phone instead of engaging with my family in these moments. But I think these shows are incredibly popular because they speak to this desire of resolution. They speak to this desire of things aren't right and we're going to have answers. There's going to be justice. There's going to be some end to this tragedy. This is not that kind of mystery with Christ. This isn't the kind of mystery that we can solve in 30 to 45 minutes if we find the right clue or if we find the right evidence. It's not so much that we get to figure it out. We have to learn to sit in the confusion and sit in the doubt and sit in the wonder. There are some moments in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus does some crazy things, particularly as a young child, and it says that his mother doesn't really know what to do, but she holds these things in her heart and ponders them. That's what I find myself doing with the resurrection so often. I know that I hope that my suffering is not the end of my story. I know that I hope that death is not the end of any of our stories or end of the story of all of creation and the world we live in. This story of Jesus Christ and his life, death, and resurrection gives me meaning and truth and purpose and direction in my life. And so the things I don't understand in the mystery of it all, I sit and ponder in my heart. I said last week that I think so often we want like a snapshot that says clearly with all of the detail, a photo or a video or something to say, this is how it happened, this is where it is, this is the proof. And that is what I hear Thomas saying. Give me that CSI report, put the detectives on the case, show me the evidence that says, here is where the nails went, here's where the sword went, and look, he is still among us. I think oftentimes, since we don't have time travel or anything, we didn't have photo evidence, we want something like this painting by Diego Vasquez, who painted in the 1600s. We have an image of this we can put on the screen here in just a moment. So this one on the right, I keep these in my office as sort of a reminder of these kind of things. I think so often we want this kind of faith experience that has great detail. This painting from Vasquez was in some ways considered very revolutionary because he painted the human body with such detail and nuance, with the muscles of Christ and the facial expression and even some of the things that disturb us, the violence of it. It maybe makes you feel the weight of what has happened there. And I think Thomas wants to say, show me this. Show me all of the detail. My pain needs to see it reflected in detail of what exactly happened. And his friends do something interesting. I love what his friends do. They don't get into a debate with Thomas to say, no, man, you're wrong. Here's exactly what we saw. Here's exactly what happened. We got to argue with Thomas to make sure his doubts go away because we're going to prove it to him with our argument. No, they just say, they don't say much. They just get back together for dinner, and Thomas is there with them. They let him be there with all of his doubts. With Thomas hungry for this, give me the details, give me the facts. And whenever Jesus shows up again, what he finds is that it is not as simple as seeing the facts. He would love this much more snapshot-like image of Christ to understand. And I think instead what I sense is that he gets something more like this other painting from Salvador Dali from the 1950s. It has some of the same information. Christ is on the cross, but it has something else. There's some other quality to it that we just can't quite wrap our arms around or our minds around. Christ is there with his wounds, but it's somehow more complex. It's somehow bigger. It's somehow different than what Thomas or anyone had expected. It's not just their own personal grief, it's this bigger thing. I love how Dali captures this. It's like Christ over everything. There's room for you and me somewhere in there. There's room for the things we don't understand in there. I think there's weight and significance to both of these interpretations of what happens to Christ on the cross. And there's room for us to interpret and find our place in the artistic expression of this. But I find one to be incredibly concrete and one to leave a little different experience of breath or a different experience of space. Now, some of this has to do with when these artists are alive and painting, right? They're influenced by their cultures. They're influenced by their times. Diego is in the 17th century and Dali's in the 20th century. That says a lot about their world and their philosophies and what's going on. But I find myself, and I keep these pictures hanging in my office, drawn at different times to both of them. I struggle with Velázquez. I struggle with the detail and the concrete. And I find myself sitting and wondering about the possibility that Dali expresses as well. I think some of it is not so much that we cast out our doubts and have them conquered by all of the facts, so much as maybe God grows some hope and possibility we couldn't have dreamed of otherwise and sets us out in a different way than where we were before, be it at the empty tomb or be it in the room with Jesus' closest followers. I understand this is not the most linear sermon you've probably ever heard. Here's step one, here's step two, here's step three, here is how we live like Thomas. I preached about Thomas 3 years ago in this space, and what I talked about a lot was how he was a doubter, but he still gave his whole life to Christ, and I think still that's very, very true. But I'm not sure the invitation is to figure out Thomas, and I'm not sure the invitation for the resurrection to be good news and unbelievable in the best way for us. I'm not sure there's some secret to unlock that makes it all make sense to us. I want to sit in the mystery between these images. I want to sit in the mystery between where Christ has suffered, where Christ has loved, where Christ is bringing new life again and again, and I want to ponder that and sit with it. I want to do that because I am looking for good news in my places where I'm wounded. I'm looking for good news in the places where I'm searching. I'm looking for good news in the places where I need hope and belonging. For Jesus and his friends, I think part of it was they brought their hopelessness and their fear that their story was reaching an end. And they saw that in their wounds and grief, there was some new possibility because Jesus' wounds took on the weight, Jesus' pain took on the pain, and Jesus' life brought new possibility. I'm only here because when I came to church as a young person, my fears and doubts and worries that I was never going to be good enough, I was never going to belong enough, I was never going to be lovable enough, that those things were met by unconditional love by those who brought Christ to life for me. Who in my doubts, my struggles, my worries, did not make me prove anything to belong, but like Thomas, they just let me be. And like Thomas, I found that Christ was somehow present in a way I couldn't wrap my mind or my arms around because others were loving, welcoming, patient, kind, all the things that Christ was in his life. But also I found in their own woundedness, they stood in that place of Christ to say, my pain too, my fear too, my doubt too. And in bearing the weight of life together, we also found some hope for a different future together as well. That's why I stand here. That's why I'm a Christian. For better or worse, that's probably why I'm a pastor as well. And I can't quite articulate it to you other than to say it's a mystery that people have brought to life for me. It's a mystery that the church as the body of Christ has brought to life for me, whether I'm hungering for the detail or finding myself in some other place with awe and wonder. That's why I want to celebrate Holy Communion together as a community today. Because we remember that mystery. Communion can be a lot of things for us. It can be the details of remembering the facts of Jesus' last night of his life. It can be remembering the facts of the wounds in his hands and his suffering and his death. And it can be remembering the facts of an empty tomb and what that can be for us. But it can also be a mysterious way that we find ourselves in the story as well. Because we stand in a place holding bread and offering bread saying, Christ's wounds are there with you and me both. Christ pouring out of himself is there for you and me both. And in a mystery that I can't quite articulate, we stand in the place of Christ for one another. We stand in the grace of Christ for one another. And Christ is alive and present with us as we hold not just some bread and a cup of juice, but we hold the very essence and being that God is with us, within us, and binding us together. I hope that's wherever you stand in this journey of wherever you're searching for that hope in life, that is something you might encounter when we gather like those disciples did. They gathered for a meal and saw their friend, their leader, their teacher take bread and do something different with it than they were expecting. Said, this is my body. The essence of who I am is like this bread nourishing you and giving you life. As often as you gather and break this bread and share in this meal, remember me. Remember that your life comes from the sustenance that Christ gives. Later in the meal, he took a cup and again did something unexpected with it. He gave thanks to God and gave it to his friends and said, share in this, each of you. This is a cup of forgiveness and freedom and hope. It is my essence poured out for you, my life poured out for you. As often as you gather, remember how I loved, how I forgave, how I welcomed. Do likewise. And we gather in those same places. We gather to find our place in the story. We gather to find our place in the mystery, to hold it and ponder it and hopefully live it.